Howdy sociologists, congratulations, you made it! The final video about the community topic. So, let's get into it. Your learning goals for today are, you're going to know what geographic characteristics of a community are. You're going to understand that term. You're going to know the importance of backyards. Weird, but it's going to happen. And you're going to be able to analyze. So you're going to have a task where you must analyze and evaluate. That's where we need to get to. Okay. So, geographic characteristics. What you talking about, Willis? This is what I'm talking about. Here are some examples. How close you are to other people, to other houses. How accessible it is for people with different levels of mobility. What's the climate like? Cold and rainy? New Zealand. Warm and sunny? Queensland. What's the scenic quality? Is there lots of green spaces, trees, birds? Or is it just gross and heaps of rubbish? What are the landforms? Are there mountains around? Lakes, rivers, plains, deserts? No. What natural resources are there in the area? Lots of wood, lots of animals. Who knows? And what about the built features? And what I mean by built features, we're talking about how dense the housing is. Is it high rise? Everything got a big backyard? What's the transport situation like? Is it all cars? Are there cycle lanes? Blah blah blah. What's the green space situation? Parks. And remember, parks are natural. Parks are built, so those green spaces would be classified as a built feature. And what are their community centres, community facilities in these built areas? It was a bit of a struggle to find images relating to the stuff on that last slide. I did find this, well, I'm a bit of a nerd and I like reading research. So this is a research article from a journal. Talks about the geography of community. I just want to skim read some of this stuff here. So it's a US thing, but it has some really interesting things to say. Here we go. So the federal government's support for highways and home ownership isolates the poor and racial minorities in particular. So what it's saying is that urban planning in the US, and it's similar here, benefits the rich more than it does the poor. There you go. And this is quite interesting. As a result, fewer and fewer Americans encounter on a regular basis people whose opinions are different from their own. Now think about that. If you don't ever encounter people who have different opinions to you, you're not ever going to be able to change your views. And we see this in the US, and it's definitely starting to happen here as well. There's a really big divide between groups. So especially what you'll hear like left wing and right wing, and these people with different political views, because of the way that communities are built these days and everybody just travels from place to place in cars rather than walking around the street and randomly running into people who don't have the same views as them, people end up only spending time with people who already agree with them, and so their views get more and more further away from others. So I thought that was a really interesting little result. So you think, oh yeah, the layout of community doesn't make that much difference. But what we're saying is, it really does. Right, continuing on with geographic characteristics. Well, for a geographic community, we're talking about these things. How big is that community? What scale is it? Is it the local scale, the national scale, the international scale? How dense is it? How close together are the houses? And what kind of design and layout? And how do all of these 5 things affect community members? So here's someone imagining an eco-neighborhood, yeah? Earth Song eco-neighborhood. So have a look there. You know, when people come up with these ideal communities, you find there's a lot of green spaces and the housing is not that dense, which suggests to me that actually most people would probably agree in the ideal world we would have less dense living areas and more green spaces. Yeah. Here's another one. Similar. Yeah. Lots of empty space between the buildings and Jindabyne. This is somewhere in Melbourne. I think I've been there. Anyway, so this is a design for a new community. This is what town planners do, urban planners. Another mini case study. Yeah, this one's about the loss of backyards. It's a crime, I tell you. Right, we're losing backyards. New houses take up the whole backyard with a tiny yard. Yeah. So if you have a look at satellite images, and I'm going to show you some in a minute, what you'll see is that with the block of land, rather than putting a house on it and having a backyard, people now are just building their house right up to the fence. So the inside of the house is massive, but there's no backyard. No space to play, no space for plants. Sad. Now there's this thing called biophilia, where there's a link between plants and people. There's lots of research on well-being that shows that people benefit from natural environments, from hanging out with plants. Psychologists these days, you know, you can go in there with a mental health problem and they can go, well, I could give you this really, really strong psychoactive drug, or you could just go and walk in the forest for 2 hours a day. Maybe that's a bit much. Maybe like 2 hours a week. So like spending time in nature with plants is beneficial to our well-being. But if we get rid of all of that green space by having no backyards and a bigger house, we've got problems. Yeah, benefits well-being. Okay, so here's the question. Do we really need such massive houses? We are possession obsessed. We've got to put all of our stuff somewhere, and so we have these huge houses. I am guilty of that. In the 1950s, so in the older suburbs of Melbourne, all houses had massive backyards. Like the house I'm living in has got a huge backyard. If I have a look at the houses around this area, that's a new growth area, big houses, no backyard. So, what could be done about this? Could have more parks? Are people always going to go to the park to hang outside though? Or could we just have bigger backyards? We just open your door and there it is. So here's an example. That's not too bad actually. I mean, there's little front yards, but there's not really much place to play. The next slide shows it a bit better. So this website called The Conversation had an entire article about, I have to get it to play. Here we go. Yep. About vanishing backyards. Yep. Stresses us out. The traditional Australian suburban backyard is being lost to high dense housing. Yeah, so cities are stressful places and you reduce that stress by spending time in nature, but people don't really because they don't have any backyards. Yeah. So city dwellers do have advantages, but they have a disadvantage in that there's more anxiety and depression in cities. See, 39% greater risk of mood disorders than rural dwellers. It's really good for children's mental development to play in green spaces. And then they do a little mini example of Perth, where, and I think we're going to see some images in a second of what the housing looked like. So there you go, have a look at that. There's no backyard. That's Ellenbrook, and there's hardly any green space. The houses just go right up to the edges. A lot of solar panels though, that's great. Another thing is that green spaces absorb heat, and so if you only have concrete and housing, the place becomes hotter. So if you've got suburbs that have no backyards, and here's a perfect example. On the left is an older suburb, bluer means colder, and on the right is a newer suburb, redder is hotter. So these newer suburbs with very little backyards are super, super hot. There you go. Right, so this activity is an analysis. So thinking about Australia, I want you to analyse urban communities in terms of Gemeinschaft, a community, and Gesellschaft, the society. Right, so what Gemeinschaft do you think you belong to? What are the benefits and drawbacks, that should be drawbacks, of this community? What Gesellschaft do you think you belong to? What are the benefits and drawbacks of this society? So what community do you feel like you belong to, and what's good and bad about it? What society do you feel like you're a part of, and what are the good and bad bits of that? In your exercise book, thank you. Okay, so this video identifies 7 principles for building better cities. Check it out.
So let me add to the complexity of the situation we find ourselves in. At the same time that we're solving for climate change, we're going to be building cities for 3 billion people. That's a doubling of the urban environment. If we don't get that right, I'm not sure all the climate solutions in the world will save mankind, because so much depends on how we shape our cities, not just environmental impacts, but our social well-being, our economic vitality, our sense of community and connectedness. Fundamentally, the way we shape cities is a manifestation of the kind of humanity we bring to bear. And so getting it right is, I think, the order of the day. And to a certain degree, getting it right can help us solve climate change, because in the end, it's our behavior that seems to be driving the problem. The problem isn't free-floating, and it isn't just ExxonMobil and oil companies. It's us, how we live. How we live. There's a villain in this story. It's called sprawl, and I'll be upfront about that. But it's not just the kind of sprawl you think of, or many people think of, as low-density development out at the periphery of the metropolitan area. Actually, I think that sprawl can happen anywhere at any density. The key attribute is that it isolates people. It segregates people into economic enclaves and land use enclaves. It separates them from nature. It doesn't allow the cross-fertilization, the interaction that make cities great places and that make society thrive. And so the antidote to sprawl is really what we all need to be thinking about, especially when we're taking on this massive construction project. So let me take you through one exercise. We did this, developed a model for the state of California so they could get on with reducing carbon emissions. We did a whole series of scenarios for how the state could grow. And this is just one overly simplified one. We mixed different development prototypes and said they're going to carry us through the year 2050, 10 million new crew in our state of California. And one was sprawl. It's just more of the same: shopping malls, subdivisions, office parks. The other one was dominated by not everybody moving to the city, but just compact development, what we used to think of as streetcar suburbs, walkable neighborhoods, low rise, but integrated, mixed-use environments. And the results are astounding. They're astounding not just for the scale of the difference of this one shift in our city-making habit, but also because each one represents a special interest group. A special interest group that used to advocate for their concerns one at a time. They did not see what I call co-benefits of urban form, and that allows them to join with others. So land consumption, environmentalists are really concerned about this. So are farmers. There's a whole range of people, and of course neighborhood groups that want open space nearby. The sprawl version of California, it almost doubles the physical footprint. Greenhouse gas, tremendous savings, because in California our biggest carbon emission comes from cars. And cities that don't depend on cars as much obviously create huge savings. Vehicle miles traveled, that's what I was just talking about. Just reducing the average 10,000 miles per household per year from somewhere in the mid 26,000 per household has a huge impact, not just on air quality and carbon, but also on the household pocketbook. It's very expensive to drive that much. And as we've seen, the middle class is struggling to hold on. Healthcare, we were talking about how do you fix it once we broke it, clean the air. Why not just stop polluting? Why not just use our feet and bikes more? And that's a function of the kinds of cities that we shape. Household costs. 2008 was a mark in time, not of just financial industry running amok. It was that we were trying to sell too many of the wrong kind of housing. Large lot, single family, distant, too expensive for the average middle-class family to afford, and quite frankly, not a good fit to their lifestyle anymore. But in order to move inventory, you can discount the financing and get it sold. I think that's a lot of what happened. Reducing costs by $10,000. Remember, California, the median is $50,000. This is a big element. That's just cars and utility costs. So the affordable housing advocates, who often sit off in their silo, separate from the environmentalists, separate from the politicians, everybody fighting with everyone, is now beginning to see common cause. And I think the common cause is what really brings about the change. Los Angeles, as a result of these efforts, has now decided to transform itself into a more transit-oriented environment. As a matter of fact, since 2008, they voted in $400 billion of bonds for transit, as opposed to, and $0 for new highways. What a transformation. LA becomes a city of walkers in transit, not a city of cars. How does it happen? You take the least desirable land, the strip, you add, where there's space, transit, and then you infill mixed-use development. You satisfy new housing demands, and you make the existing neighborhoods all around it more complex, more interesting, more walkable. Okay, here's another kind of sprawl. China, high-density sprawl, what you think of as an oxymoron, but the same problems, everything isolated in superblocks. And of course, this amazing smog that was just spoken to. 12% of GDP in China now is spent on the health impacts of that. The history, of course, of Chinese cities is robust. It's like any other place. Community was all about small local shops and local services and walking, interacting with your neighbors. May sound utopian, but it's not. It's actually what people really want. The new super blocks, these are blocks that would have 5,000 units in them. And they're gated as well because nobody knows anybody else. And of course, there isn't even a sidewalk. No ground floor shops, a very sterile environment. I found this one case here in one of the super blocks where people had illicitly set up shops in their garages so that they could have that kind of local service economy. The desire of people to get it right is there. We just have to get the planners on board and the politicians. All right, some technical planning stuff. Chongqing is a city of 30 million people. It's almost as big as California. This is a small growth area. They wanted us to test the alternative to sprawl in several cities across China. This is for 4.5 million people. What the takeaway from this image is, every one of those circles is a walking radius around a transit station. Massive investment in metro and BRT, and a distribution that allows everybody to work within walking distance of that. The red area, this is a blow-up. All of a sudden, our principles called for green space, preserving the important ecological features, and then those other streets in there are auto-free streets. So instead of bulldozing, leveling the site, and building right up to the river, this green edge was something that really wasn't normative in China until these set of practices began experimentation there. The urban fabric, small blocks, maybe 500 families per block. They know each other. The street perimeter has shops, so there's local destinations. And the streets themselves become smaller because there are more of them. Very simple, straightforward urban design. Now here you have something I dearly love. Think of the logic. If only a third of the people have cars, why do we give 100% of our streets to cars? What if we gave 70% of the streets to car-free, to everybody else, so that the transit could move well for them, so that they could walk, so they could bike? Why not have geographic equity in our circulation system? And quite frankly, cities would function better. No matter what they do, no matter how many ring roads they build in Beijing, they just can't overcome complete gridlock. So this is an auto-free street, mixed use along the edge. It has transit running down the middle. I'm happy to make that transit autonomous vehicles, but maybe I'll have a chance to talk about that later. So there are 7 principles that have now been adopted by the highest levels in the Chinese government, and they're moving to implement them. And they're simple, and they are globally, I think, universal principles. One is to preserve the natural environment, the history, and the critical agriculture. Second is mix. Mixed use is popular, but when I say mix, I mean mixed incomes, mixed age groups, as well as mixed land use. Walk. There's no great city that you don't enjoy walking in. You don't go there. The places you go on vacation are places you can walk. Why not make it everywhere? Bike is the most efficient means of transportation we know. China has now adopted policies that put 6 meters of bike lane on every street. They're serious about getting back to their biking history. Complicated planaries here, connect. It's a street network that allows many routes instead of singular routes and provides many kinds of streets instead of just one. Ride. We have to invest more in transit. There's no silver bullet. Autonomous vehicles are not going to solve this for us. As a matter of fact, they're going to generate more traffic, more VMT than the alternative. And focus. We have a hierarchy of the city based on transit rather than the old armature of freeways. It's a big paradigm shift. But those two things have to get reconnected in ways that really shape the structure of the city. So I'm very hopeful. In California, United States, China, these changes are well accepted. I'm hopeful for two reasons. One is most people get it. They understand intrinsically what a great city can and should be. And the second is that the kind of analysis we can bring to bear now allows people to connect the dots, allows people to shape political coalitions that didn't exist in the past. That allows them to bring into being the kinds of communities we all need. Thank you.
That's great. So, okay, autonomous driving, self-driving cars, a lot of people here are very excited about them. What are your concerns or issues about them?
Well, you know, I think there's almost too much hype here. First is, everybody says, well, we're going to get rid of a lot of cars. What they don't say is you're going to get a lot more vehicle miles. You're going to get a lot more cars moving on streets. There's be more congestion.
Because they're so appealing to, well, you can drive while reading or sleeping.
Couple reasons. One is, if they're privately owned, people will travel greater distances. It'll be a new lease on life to sprawl. If you can work on your way to work, you can live in more remote locations. It'll revitalize sprawl in a way that I'm deeply frightened. Taxis. About 50% of the survey says that people won't share them. If they don't share them, you can end up with a 90% increase in vehicle miles traveled. If you share them, you're still at around 30% increase in VMT.
Sharing them meaning having multiple people riding at once and some sort of intelligent ride sharing.
So the Uber share without a steering wheel.
Yeah.
The reality is the efficiency of vehicles, you know, you can do it with or without a steering wheel. It doesn't matter. They claim that they're the only ones that are going to be efficient electric, but that's not true. But the real bottom line is that walking, biking, and transit are the way cities and communities thrive. And putting people in their private bubbles, whether they have a steering wheel or not, is the wrong direction. And quite frankly, the image of an AV on its way to McDonald's to pick up a pack without its owner, just being sent off on these kind of random errands, is really frightening to me.
Well, thank you for that. And I have to say, the images you showed of those mixed-use streets, really inspiring, really beautiful. Thank you for your work, Peter. Thank you.
This video does well to answer the question, what is planning? Take it away.
Ever wonder how a community kind of just happens? Because it's a bit of a small miracle. The places we live are like theatres, where hundreds, thousands and sometimes millions of people are simultaneously living, eating, buying, selling, making, working, romancing, moving, building. It's amazing the whole thing doesn't all fall apart. But have you ever thought about what's going on behind the scenes? Before I go any further, I am not talking about event planning here. This has nothing to do with weddings. Planning is the process through which governments, businesses and residents come together to shape their communities. It's so important there's an entire profession dedicated to it. Planners. Like the communities they work in, the planning profession is complex and diverse. Some planners work on issues like housing, working towards providing safe and affordable places to live in. Other planners work in transport, improving networks of roads, trails, bus routes, footpaths and bike lanes to help everyone get around. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Planners are also involved in design, protecting heritage, promoting energy efficiency, celebrating the arts and culture, protecting the environment and protecting places from flooding or fire or drought because climate change. The list goes on and on and on. And whether they work in government, the private sector or in not-for-profits, planners are tasked with finding solutions to those issues. They conduct research, consult with professionals, they analyse, try to predict the future, and in the process they write reports, give presentations, talk to the community, create models and designs and make maps. They make lots and lots of maps. And when all of that comes together, planners, well, they plan. They create policies and promote good planning outcomes to help guide communities towards the future. But good planning isn't just a document, it's a process, one that consults and collaborates with people. It's key that planners recognise change and work with communities to plan for it, rather than being overwhelmed by it. But above all, planning is an attitude, one that firmly believes that when people work together, they can make a difference. And that's planning in a nutshell, or at least what we can say about planning in a minute or two. It can seem like organised chaos at times, but that's the hard work that goes on behind the scenes to make sure that our communities are enjoyable and worthwhile to live in. If you want to learn more about planning and the profession, check out the Planning Institute on their website at www.planning.org.au.
And a video about the growth of Melbourne and some of the urban planning thoughts that have gone into it. Check this one out.
Melbourne is growing, and it's growing fast. By 2026, the population of Melbourne is projected to hit 5 million people. Historically, Melbourne has pushed outwards and created new suburbs to house its growing population. But when most of the growth of a city happens at its fringes, it leads to urban sprawl, and that brings some serious challenges and pressures. Expanding the limits of the city means destroying important farmland, forest and open green space. Now this is all happening quite far away, so what's it got to do with you? A lot, as it turns out. We all pay for this urban sprawl through increased costs and taxes. It's very expensive for governments to build new roads, schools and hospitals. It also costs a lot to put in new services like water, gas, electricity and sewerage. There's little in the way of public transport in these areas, which leaves residents dependent on their cars to get around. And so, ever-growing numbers of people are driving from the outer suburbs towards the city to access their jobs and the services they need. And they're travelling through suburbs close to the city, just like yours. And that's leading to increased traffic congestion and pollution. The reality is, if you live anywhere in Melbourne, this affects you. Our state governments have grappled with this challenge for quite some time, and both sides of politics have come to the same conclusion. Melbourne can't keep spreading forever. Now, there is a place for new suburbs, but the answer to this challenge lies in other approaches too. Things like renewing old brownfield sites like Fisherman's Bend, as well as continuing to focus on building up population and housing density in and around Melbourne's established centres. These inner urban centres, which were nominated by the state government, are busy, vibrant hubs with shops, services and good access to public transport. Now that makes these areas very appealing to a growing number of people who want to be able to cycle or walk to the things they need in their local community and rely less on cars. It also makes these areas good locations to have a diverse mix of housing to accommodate population growth. As the population ages and family sizes get smaller, there's more and more demand for smaller homes. Older retired residents wanting to downsize, couples without children, or smaller families and young people trying to break into the housing market.
It's a real concern for me that my children won't be able to be located in such a convenient area close to the city because they won't be able to afford the housing stock that's in Moonee Valley. So I think it's really important that we have a diversity of housing stock, some apartments, some low maintenance and lower cost places that they may be able to rent or, one day hopefully buy to start off on the housing ladder because they won't be able to afford the housing stock that's here now.
The idea of these centres is to have enough people living in and around an area to make it a viable centre, with successful businesses generating local jobs and attracting more services, better public transport and improved community facilities. At a local level, it's up to councils to make sure that these centres achieve all the objectives set by the state government, as well as ensuring that these centres are places people want to live and feel a sense of community. Melbourne's population will continue to increase, there is no doubt about it, and inner urban areas like Moonee Valley will continue to face the challenge of accommodating some of that growth. The key is to try to manage the growth locally in a planned way, and councils do this by developing long-term strategies like structure plans. Now, without robust plans, there's the potential for this growth and development to happen in an ad hoc way. Change is not easy, and this is a challenging process, but it's one that needs to happen if we want our city to be a great place to live, work and visit in the future.
Your homework for today: imagine today's lesson was an event and you had to write a headline for it in the newspaper. One short sentence. Do it. Woo! We made it. Homework. You're so cool. Read those 3 pages and complete this content test. So this is a content test on about the last 12 pages or so. Just keep redoing that until you can get 100% on it. All right. Thank you so much for participating in this lesson, and do not ever forget to keep it real.